These two clips are the exact same. I know you're probably rolling your eyes as you browse the suggested videos tab, but hear me out. The first clip is of Turnstile, a hardcore punk band from Baltimore, and I'm claiming it's the same as Colt Cabana, a pro wrestler from Chicago, doing this?
Hey, oh no! No! This is public humiliation! What is he? Oh, he's taking... No.
If you're looking plainly on the surface, you may notice that these are two completely different styles of entertainment. However, the similarities begin to reveal themselves when you look behind the scenes, on the road, and in the hearts and minds of the performers and fans. This won't be a deep dive, because it doesn't need to be. I'm merely going to turn the focus from the product of punk and wrestling to the people of punk and wrestling, and it won't take me long to prove that Colt Cabana and Brendan Yates from Turnstile are virtually identical. I'm Dan Frampton, this is The Dean Project, and before we get into the video, I just want to mention my record. It's on Spotify. It's The Dean Project LP. Give it a listen in a bit, would ya? Both punk and wrestling cater to a die-hard, loyal fan base with, casuals that pop in from time to time. But to understand the DNA of the culture, we need to go back a little farther. We could go all the way back to the 1920s, but for brevity's sake, I think we're gonna stick to the bodacious 1980s, but stick around for my How Lou Thez Changed Punk Rock video.
Tony, Billy Robinson from England.
You see, in the 80s, there was no internet, so all the punk and wrestling that was happening were happening in what wrestling called territories and punk called scenes. Each region had its own set of stars and promoters. Wrestling had Memphis, Texas, Florida, Philly, California, and New York, and punk had DC, Seattle, Florida, Philly, California, and New York. You see, same towns, it's already the same. But that's not really that big of a deal because those are huge markets. What about the small markets? What about Poughkeepsie? Wrestling would hit the mainstream in this era before punk would. And that would happen when Vince McMahon, the owner of the New York territory, just bought up all the other territories, and because they had TV deals in place, now his product, rebranded as the WWF, was now nationwide. Now kids all over the country could dream of being a cool big bad wrestling guy. But the punk world would see its time in the sun in 1994 when MTV would basically just turn into Green Day TV. The seeds of the culture have been firmly planted in the imagination of the kids, so now you could go pick up a guitar or run to the gym. But now, as we move through the 90s and into the 2000s, the global coverage just gets oversaturated and the cool factor begins to drop a little bit. Big companies would commodify the artists and manufacture a bunch of bullshit that would just make the fans dip. And when they dipped, not all of them, but some of them would find themselves in the underground. And in the late 90s, early 2000s, the underground of wrestling and punk was a great place to be. You notice, holy crap, the 80s ethic of all this DIY culture, it's still here. And you didn't need to look any farther than ROH, that wrestling company that had all the best wrestlers that I've ever seen in my life, wearing gear that they looked like they bought at Walmart the night before. Punk record sales were down at this point because of downloads and all that sort of thing. But shows and festivals were still huge and the main lifeblood of all this. Both bands and wrestlers would tour town to town, venue to venue for a hot dog and a handshake. They did it because they loved it. They did it because they believed in themselves, and they did it because they knew the people loved it. It all meant something to them. It was clear the passion and the drive was still present even after the global commodification of it all. And that takes us to where we started. That takes us back to Colt Cabana and Turnstile. Both acts demonstrate huge commitment to the DIY ethics behind their presentation. It meant something to the people to be more approachable, to be more relatable than your typical superstar, Colt Cabana would even design and sew up all his own ring gear, meanwhile bringing his sewing machine to the venues of the shows and just whipping up a few quick headbands before the matches.
I've been there at AEW where somebody needs something and the gear makers are a little too busy, and then I'll grab something and help somebody seam up something for them. That's not a problem. And I've done it for myself a million times. It also got to the point where we had a lot of time off where I would just start making headbands at AEW. I would take the extra sewing machine, I would bring it into the locker room, and while we were in the locker room, I would start sewing some of my headbands together.
Those headbands would be the merch that he'd be selling at his merch table. And we're here at the merch table, we might as well talk about it for a minute. It's huge in both worlds. I'd even say essential. Merch table culture inspires performers to put on emotionally driven, high energy performances that inspire the audience to want to meet them. If this is done in a way that connects with the audience, that audience is gonna want a designated spot to go up to you and say, hey man, good set. If you provide that spot and fill it with sick shit, the fans will organically feel inclined to tokenize this memory with a physical item. This practice alone turns any wannabe musician and wrestler into a legitimate entrepreneur. On the other side of the coin though, the fans don't see it as a grift. In fact, quite the opposite. Oftentimes setting aside 10 times the price of admission just for merch. And if your friend can't go to the show, he's probably gonna ask you to pick up a t-shirt or something, and he's not gonna pay you back. This street works two ways, and it all hinges on amazing performances. And there is something to be said about an act that gets too big that the DIY ethics just isn't enough to run their fucking thing anymore, you know what I'm saying? And they've shattered all their indie goals, so what else is out there? Sometimes you gotta sign to a major, and that's where we see Turnstile on Roadrunner and Colt Cabana signed to AEW. But neither party have lost their appeal, and that's unprecedented. That's magical. That's amazing. Well, it's not unprecedented. It's happened a couple other times. The hustle and the lifestyle required of the performers in both genres is bound to attract the same type of creative, bet on themselves type people. Living that lifestyle is bound to create similar habits and behaviors, such as creative planning, touring, and performing, alongside all that fun, wonderful, not at all disgusting stuff that happens on the road. All this, plus the fact that the big companies didn't ruin them, proves my point. Let's take a look at those clips again.
We saw a flying asshole out of MJF.
You see it now, don't you? Identical. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, check out my video over here about the Bay Area.